Welcome to Educators on Education, a Study.com webinar series. While we wait for others to join the line, please answer the poll on your screen. How does your school administer the PSAT? Which grades are included? Do you offer it to 9th, 10th, 11th graders throughout the school? 10th and 11th graders throughout the school? 11th graders only? Are students selected and invited to take the PSAT? Are students asked to pay for the PSAT to participate, or do you just not offer it with your school? So go ahead and answer that poll while you wait. I'm excited to have you join us for our Help Students Say Yes to the Right Test, Understanding PSAT Scores to Guide Student Success webinar. We have a large group on the line, so we do have attendees muted. That said, any questions you have, please navigate to the Q&A tab on and our team will be monitoring inquiries there. We'll also do a formal Q&A at the end. Just going to give us another moment for people to answer the poll. All right, and we'll share those results so that you guys can see how people are answering. All right, so my name is Charlotte Payton, and I am a partnership manager at Study.com. I've been in education for the last 18 years, and I'm a former high school teacher with a master's in literacy and currently working on my doctorate in educational leadership. I've been supporting schools and teachers in ed tech since 2016. Today, I would like to welcome Rachel Mead, who is the co-founder of Enhanced Prep and a subsidiary of Study.com. Rachel is an educator first and foremost, with over 25 years of tutoring and test prep experience. Rachel has been a premier level tutor and master trainer of tutors for 3 of the largest test prep companies in the country. She started Enhanced Prep because she knows there is a better way to elevate the experience for both students and parents, and works closely with the staff to build customized prep plans for all Enhanced Prep students. Rachel is also ISEE and SSAT specialist. Rachel has a real passion for helping students and parents navigate what it will take to make their Reach School a reality. So welcome, Rachel, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I'm so excited to share with the team with us here today about resources that they can put at their disposal to help students say yes to the right test. That's definitely part of our agenda as we're working on things, and a big takeaway that I want you to walk away equipped with from this. We have seen differences ranging in upwards of 60 percentile points when students say yes to the right test, and we want to make sure that you and your school and your families are equipped and ready to do exactly that, capitalize on the difference between these and help students maximize on their performance. So there are many different ways that the PSAT can come. We like to call them flavors. Today, we're going to be coming through and talking specifically about the PSAT in its NMSQT alphabet soup format here, which is the National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, which is where the results have been coming out the past 2 days as a result of the work the students did back in October. A couple of things to point out: while PSAT scores do vary state to state in terms of those merit qualifying, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, I also want to give you a point of reference on a national landscape as you're taking a look at what your 10th graders did and what those averages are across the writing and language or their verbal scores compared to the 11th graders, what the math or quantitative portions of these tests equate to, and then of course the ever important, how does that composite compare? So when you're looking at the scores for your school, you can come back and say, how are we doing as a 10th grade group? How are we doing as an 11th grade group? And how does that compare against the national averages that result from these exams? When we're looking at national merit qualifying scores, again, these do range state to state, as it is the top 0.5% of each state that can qualify for national merit. So what I've done here is I have gathered the states with some of the lower scores. So 210 is the lowest score across all states, and that's coming in through North Dakota and West Virginia. Then we see our California, DC, others of that coming across with the highest qualifying score for national merit at that 222. We'll talk more specifically about how this is calculated and what this means in terms of students' performance, but it's really important to again recognize that this is done on a state-by-state basis. So what is this national merit thing? Well, first and foremost, we have a large group of students, again, large when we're talking about some of the other numbers we'll be looking at, that get an amazing letter of commendation for their academic promise as a result of their performance on the NMSQT. From there, it then does break down into a smaller group that becomes semifinalists for this scholarship. And it's important to notice that what happens here is this notification is sent to the student's high school. And then as they move forward to the potential finalist format of it, this is done in mail to the student's home address. So there's lots of different types of communication that comes out, and we want to make sure that students and parents are very aware of this, as well as any potential deadlines and to-dos that they have to manage as a result. So what happens in terms of this scholarship money? Well, again, keep in mind, what was that last number? Oh yeah, we had 16,000 that became semifinalists, but then what happens from there? We're dropping even further. We're cutting that number in half. So that's where we go from the 1% as the semifinalists down to that 0.5% that become the actual merit scholarship winners. This does equate to a scholarship in the amount of $2,500 for them if they are getting it from NMSQT. Keep in mind there are some additional both corporate and college sponsorship that can result as well. You can see that there's a smaller number of these that are of course awarded, and they do have varying amounts with them as well too. So let's see here as we're getting into the score reports to give you more ammunition and understanding of what this does for you. I'd love to get some feedback on your comfort level with PSAT score reports, please. So you should have that poll that popped up on your screen for us. Again, what I have here are some samples of what's happening within the front cover and within that first page. And I just want to get an idea of how much time we should be spending here, Charlotte. So what are we seeing? Awesome. So we've got a pretty wide range here. Some vary, some somewhat, some not at all. Okay. So keep in mind here on this front page, again, it is identifying the name of the student that this relates to. It's also important that they're hanging on to their access code and their College Board ID, because this is going to allow them to go into their profile that will give them some specific targeted customized information based upon what happened for that unique student within their own PSAT. As we open up the score report inside here, you're going to go ahead and see the total or that composite score, how the student did with their verbal and their math combined. And then underneath that, we will have both the breakdown of the verbal and the math separately, as well as an indicator bar of what is happening as a reflection of college readiness. Finally, inside this front cover is we do have the selection score index, which I have another slide that will talk more specifically about that on. So this is again dialing into that viewpoint for you. The score, composite score, does relate to a percentile. And I want to really come back and stress here that this is not a percentage that we're so used to seeing of what happens within the school systems on how a student performs, but a percentile, which means it's all done on a bell curve. How well did this student do compared to all of the other students in the nation of the same grade level that took the test at the same time?
Rachel, can I ask a question? So am I
Please.
understanding this correctly, that a student's scores might change year to year, even if they get the same raw score, that percentile ranking might change?
That is absolutely correct. Some years we might see if a student misses 5 in their math score, they're coming in at a 650. Other times we might see that 5 could come in at a 630 or a 670. It's going to fluctuate based upon what the student population of that graduating class did with that percentile ranking bell curve performance. Did that answer that for you, Charlotte? Perfect.
Yes,
So
it did.
again, here we can see with this verbal score coming in at the 430, it's showing that they're slightly below a college level readiness benchmark, where this math score coming in at a 530 is showing slightly above that college ready level benchmark. And you can see again the specific benchmark score for that particular administration or year of that class distribution with that. So now let's talk about how the NMSQT, or that selection index. When we talked about that 210 to that 222 range, that was all coming in and discussing this National Merit Scholarship Corporation Selection Index. And so I want to make sure you understand how this is calculated. So each individual score report is going to show a 2-digit score with regards to the reading, a 2-digit score with regards to the writing and language. So here we see that 23 and that 20. Now keep in mind, if we saw that verbal come in at the 430 as it did, basically the way they got that is they added a 0 to the end of each one of these scores in order to get that total verbal score coming through. The math score is doubled and done the same way. But in terms of calculating the selection index, they take the 3 2-digit scores, or in this case, math could have that percentile as associated with it, add them together, and then multiply that score by 2 in order to get that selection index. So again, you can imagine if we're looking at scores in that 210 to that 222 range, what that's having to mean in terms of the student performance. And we'll look at some more examples of that together as well. Do we have any quick questions here about this selection index and where this is coming from each student's individual score report?
And just a reminder, you can pop those questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Also, inside this individual score report, it does give more analysis on how the student scored. Some of the things that I want to point out is it does show when a student answered a question incorrect, not only that it was incorrect, but it shows what answer they chose. It also shows how they did with regards to their free-form response questions. Within the difficulty that's highlighted on these columns right here, the number of boxes that are colored in indicates a higher degree of difficulty for that question. Now, one of the things I want to come back and stress with regards to scoring on a standardized test such as the PSAT is answering an easy question like question number 2 versus answering a hard question like question number 12 have the exact same effect on a student score. Students do not earn more points by answering difficult questions correct than they do answering those easier questions correct. So it really comes into an important piece of how we're implementing their game plan of attack when it comes to the PSAT and other standardized tests. We can take a look at how they did with regards to the number of questions they got correct over the total, as well as how many that they did answer incorrect or anything that was omitted as well. So let's talk about a couple of facts. It's really important to understand that students are going to have some emotions attached to these. That's not a bad thing. It shows that they care. But it's important that we as educators come back and reassure them that the PSAT does not reflect their intelligence. What they do in school is not a direct correlation to what shows up or their ability to perform well on these tests. These tests speak their same, a different language. The way I equate this to is we could have a really star athlete on the baseball field. They're strong, they're athletic, they can run fast, they have a great throwing arm in terms of distance. But if we were to pat them on the back and hand them a rugby ball and say, go out there and have a great game, their athleticism is going to get them so far, but understanding the rules of how to play the game and a coach to help equate that to their learning style is definitely going to be a difference maker. Unlike the PSAT and SAT that I took, and most likely many of you as well, there is no penalty for incorrect answers here anymore. And one of the things that is so relevant to stress here is these tests are not designed to demonstrate mastery. And what that means is they're designed so that only the top 10% of all test takers have the opportunity or enough time to work on every single question to the best of their ability. The vast majority of students only have time to complete about 2/3 of the exam in the amount of time given. So let's set them up by showing them what to focus in on based upon their individual skill sets. These tests are enduring. They are designed to, they have endurance. They're designed to have trap answers. The test writers intentionally contract with psychologists in terms of saying, what word or phrase can we put in here that's going to lead the student to an incorrect answer or distract them from what is happening? Because the results of this must fit that perfect bell curve. And so they have to design the test in a way that's going to establish that bell curve. As that curve starts to shift, it's never going to be, hey, we have students scoring higher and higher without students scoring lower and lower. So they must put those traps and those distractions in there in order to maximize the job of what this test is designed to do. When we take a look at what's on the PSAT and the SAT, and we'll talk a little bit more about those similarities and differences, while it does say passport to advanced math, I want to come back and stress that that does mean math up through algebra 2. There is some technically trig-based questions, but students can be answering those using their SOHCAHTOA that does come from their geometry, where they do not have to have any specific trig-based skills in order to maximize the math skills that they need on this. We have lots of editing, punctuation, structuring within grammar and writing and language. And the reading is, again, read a passage, understand the questions. Keeping in mind, we have traps and distractors within that as well. So the PSAT did change a few years back to have closer alignment with regards to the SAT so that students would have an easier time predicting if I did the SAT on the same day that I did my PSAT. In other words, I did the SAT instead, what would my score look like? So when we're looking at the reading, we see the reading only differs by 5 questions and 5 minutes. Each test has 5 passages in it, and basically the SAT adds 1 additional question per passage and gives the students 5 additional minutes to work through that section. When we're taking a look at the writing and language portion, we see the exact same number of questions and the exact same amount of time coming into play here. This is the section that's most identical between the two because it has almost the exact same degree of difficulty that comes into play, as there shouldn't be an increase in writing and language-based skills, grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, that necessarily happens between the PSAT and SAT. They expect that to be pretty well covered at that point. But we see a dramatic difference coming into play down here within these math sections. What happens here in the math with no calculator? We see the same amount of time, but we see an additional 3 questions that come into play. When we're looking at the math with calculator, we see they give the students 10 additional minutes and they have 7 additional questions that do pop into play here for them. So we have a wider range here. And again, that is one of the big reasons why the math score on the PSAT doesn't have the same ceiling as the math score on the SAT, because this is where the higher degree of difficulty questions are going to come into play. These additional questions that happen on the SAT over what the PSAT does. So I know this doesn't directly relate to the ACT for you yet. Don't worry, we'll get there. I do want to provide a real quick overview of what is on the ACT. We see English, math, reading, and science. Keep in mind that order these sections come in is different from the ordering of the sections on the SAT, and we'll talk more about that. But science can be a little bit alarming for students and for those that are not familiar with the exam. Science on the ACT is not biology, chemistry, or physics. Science on the ACT is technical reading using charts, graphs, and data. Of these 40 questions, there's typically only 3 of them that require any type of outside knowledge that does come into play. Some examples of that might be understanding what an acid versus a base is, understanding that the sun could be at its highest intensity at noon, some of those things that they try and consider a little bit more general knowledge, but not direct recollection from what's happening within their science classes. So we really look at the ACT as having 2 reading sections, one passage based, one a little bit more graphics and numbers based. When we take a look at comparisons between these, again, neither test has penalty for wrong answers. They are multiple choice. Math is a little bit different on the SAT. They cover some of the same ranges of topics. The ACT does have a slightly higher degree of difficulty, but just within a few questions there. They're about the same length when we take into account that that essay is optional, and they do require interpretation of charts and graphs. Grammar, again, which is the writing and language on the SAT versus the English on the ACT, look very, very similar. So let's talk about some of those differences. Calculators, ACT has one math section and you get to use the calculator the whole time. SAT says students warm up with a math section without that in its current version. SAT also has those grid-in or free-form response questions. As we saw when we took a look at the score report, there are a handful of questions where the SAT says we're not giving you multiple choice answers to choose from, but you must come up with that answer all on your own. ACT says everything is multiple choice only within that math. Vocabulary has a higher play on the SAT in terms of the command of vocabulary that's used. And typically it's not the most common definition that comes up, but having to understand one of the lesser used or multiple meanings of that commonplace word. ACT has fewer vocabulary questions and they tend to require much more direct definition or use of context that's happening within the passage. When we take a look at charts and graphs, SAT says charts and graphs come up anywhere, which means they put them in the reading. There's 2 passages of reading that have charts and graphs related, and there's typically about 3 writing and language questions that also require the interpretation of graphs. ACT says we're only going to put them in the math and the science portion of our exam. Historical documents is something that the SAT loves to use. There's almost always one reading passage that is written at least 100 years ago. It can also reference things such as the Gettysburg Address or the Declaration of Independence. It loves to work with Lincoln and emancipation, things of that nature. ACT tends to keep its articles much more recent. There's typically nothing past a 40-year mark. And while it might reference something historical, there's no reading of that historical piece of work that does come into play the same way it can on the SAT. Essay is no longer a portion of the SAT, and the ACT, it is considered optional. Keep in mind, we'll talk more about optional, but optional means the colleges want the students to take it. It demonstrates that academic curiosity and taking advantage of all their opportunities. Any students that are used to performing or writing within AP perspectives are going to nail the ACT essay component with the perspectives that they have to write on here and the way it is scored. So let's talk a little bit about the makeup and the scoring of these exams. And this is one of the biggest takeaways I want you to have. So really pay attention here with me for the next couple of minutes. When we look at the SAT, math makes up 50% of its total score, and reading and writing together combined as that verbal also make up 50% of that score. So 25% from reading, 25% from writing, 50% from math, and its score is for the composite is a sum. everything gets added together. When we're looking at the ACT, it is an average, and it also follows standard rules of rounding. So if a composite score were to come out at a 21.5, that would automatically round up to be a 22 in terms of the fact that it is an average. So that is very different as well. But the emphasis that it places on the scores is dramatically different than what the SAT does. Only 25% of the score on the ACT comes from math, and 75% of that comes from verbal, recognizing that science is indeed technical reading. We've got a little bit about timeline here, and again, this will just come over for you, but I do want to stress that if you have students that are have completed Algebra 2 by the end of their summer of 10th grade, that is a great time to start working on their prep, get their SAT or ACT out of the way early on in their junior year before the intensity of their academics and the importance of that GPA becomes even more important. The less we have them multitask later, the better their mental health and their ability to rise to the occasion. Keep in mind also as well too, students have through the fall of their senior year to continue to come back and test as well should they need to. When we look at admissions, we know the number one most important part of college's admissions decision comes from the GPA and that rigor of what's happening within their academic portfolio from their high school. SAT or ACT scores is the second most important thing. However, when we start looking at merit-based scholarship decisions that those colleges are making, most of them do equate the GPA and rigor equally to the SAT and the ACT scores. So the need for scholarship, SAT and ACT is going to increase the urgency for those students. We also know, of course, that depending upon the school, there's lots of other activities or pieces of that admissions package that do come into play for them as well. So again, it's helpful to talk to the students about the test scores being a part of their application and the importance of that part and where it does fit in with the rest of their portfolio or their application packet that they are submitting. So now let's get into say yes to the right test. It's important to understand that when we're talking about the US, every single four-year college and university equally accepts the SAT and the ACT with zero preference given. There is not a single college that is going to put preference on one or the other or require a student to take both. So it's our job as educators to make sure we're setting our students up to maximize their potential to show their full range of abilities by helping them say yes to the right test. So again, we always want to work on 2 official test dates into their timeline so that they can work on super scoring. We can certainly talk more about that super scoring if you are unfamiliar with it. I do want to be respectful of your time here as well. But please, since we know the majority of colleges are super scoring both exams now, please help your students put 2 official test dates into their timeline.
Hey, I have a quick question from the audience that kind
Sure.
of relates to this. So,
Yeah.
do we or you provide PSAT, SAT, ACT tutoring for students prepping for these tests? And then also, how do you build student confidence or decrease test anxiety?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time on building that confidence, and that's through a very Socratic approach. But we're also very data driven in terms of how we build those programs for them. So we take a look at where their strengths and weaknesses are, and I'll talk a little bit more about our 3 pillars. But yes, we do provide async as well as small group and individual one-on-one tutoring for students that are looking to improve their PSAT, SAT, or ACT scores with that.
Could I ask a few more questions while we're on this slide that kind of coordinate with it or correlate? What if a student doesn't take the SAT or ACT here in California? How is that viewed by the CSUs and the UCs?
So CSUs and UCs have definitely gone test blind with regards to what they're doing around those scores. But with that in mind, there has also been some legal ramifications for some of those schools as they have faced lawsuits for looking at those scores. That said, we want to make sure that we're not limiting what the students' opportunities are too early in their process of their ability to potentially apply to schools other than UCs or CU schools. You know, maybe they're going to be looking at, University of San Diego as part of this process. That's something important to keep in mind, right? So those colleges are indeed currently test blind, and it is not something that comes into play. But again, that doesn't mean that there are not scholarship opportunities that would be ruled out for those students if they're choosing to not participate within those tests or have those scores when they need to.
Okay, we're running out of time. We do have a few more questions, but we will be posting answers to those after the webinar in our follow-up emails.
Perfect. So again, while we're talking about that test blind versus test optional, blind means the college will not look at the score even if they are sent. The number of colleges that are test blind is extremely small right now. Test optional numbers did increase in 2020, but have continued to decline since then. It was a result of colleges having grace on students in the height of COVID. Optional means that a student who chooses not to test is still competing against an admission spot with a student that does. Just by taking the test, it is a way a college demonstrates academic curiosity and justification in terms of why one student should have a spot over another. So please, please, please understand, if a college is saying they are test optional, what they are really trying to tell students is they are test recommended. So here's the big takeaway for you guys. When we're looking at PSAT scores and we see a student whose reading and writing score comes in 50 or more points higher than their math score, they're showing a stronger indication to that reading and language component of it, and they're giving us a great indication they're better suited for that ACT. If that math score is higher, regardless of how much higher it is, let's point them towards the test that has more of that composite score that plays into the results of their math. Please keep in mind, nothing is better than taking a full-length practice test, but this is a great conversation piece to go ahead and start with your students. So when we're looking at those national averages, hey, if we're seeing a national average of 465 for 10th graders or 515 for those 11th graders on the verbal versus a national average on the math of 455 or that 490, we're seeing that lean towards the verbal components. We're seeing that lean towards being better suited for ACT, where when we look at this other example that I gave you in the score report, we are definitely seeing that stronger math skill. So we are seeing that lean towards the SAT here. Study.com does have information about the new digital SAT. Again, we're here to serve your students in a very ethical and high manner with regards to our service, our expertise. Please let us know how we can help. And we do have other events like this that are free for your families to attend if you're looking for us to help support your efforts in educating your community around PSAT scores. We are here to be that provider for you. I'll go ahead and turn it back to you here, Charlotte.
I was just going to say, I'm putting a link to sign up for your newsletter in the chat right now. And we will send that out as well in our follow-up email. So I do wanted to bring your attention to two webinars that are coming up. We have one that will actually be a panel discussion of CTE teachers, and then we'll also be doing a case study of a school that's using Study.com for getting their kids back on track for learning. So please join us for those as well. And finally, we have some Q&A questions we didn't get to, but we will respond to those answers. If you have any questions, the next slide will actually put our emails up there, so you can contact me directly, or you can contact Rachel as well if you have questions directly for that. And we do have one more poll, which is asking whether or not you would like to get in touch with your partnership manager. So we'd be happy to follow up and answer questions directly. So just go ahead and request that contact from us, and we'd be happy to follow up. Thank you, Rachel, so much for sharing this information.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Charlotte.
I taught this and I still learned a lot from you. So thank you.
Wonderful.
All right. Thank you so much. And we'll be sending out a recording. Goodbye, everybody.